this is a question that's almost rhetorical. I don't know that there's an answer, but it's really worth, I think, talking about anyway. Let's say the video of George Floyd's final moments never existed. Where would we be today? Do you think we'd be talking about this trial? Do you think there would be a trial? I mean, there might not have been the nationwide Black Lives Matter protest we saw raging across the country this summer. There might not be calls across the country to defund the police. A lot of things would be different. Is there any way to imagine where we might be without that footage?
No, but I think when we saw the footage, there are a lot of people, and certainly people of color and people specifically within the African-American community that are like, how many times does this happen when the camera's not rolling, when the video is not put out there? I mean, we've seen video of other individuals, yelling, "I can't breathe." We have also seen individuals not be tried for such behavior that resulted in death. I agree with what Carly said, quite frankly. The burden of proof is always going to be on the prosecution. And the defense only has to, flip one person in their favor. But at the same time, this is a difficult task. And I agree with some of what Leo said, but I want to disagree a little bit. One, because that video is so emotive, you have an emotional connection to that video, and regardless of somebody's politics or where they stand on these issues, where they stand with Black Lives Matter, or are upset with what they saw happened with the protest, and which were largely peaceful this summer, there is that, visceral emotional reaction. So I don't agree there'll be a desensitizing of the jury if they play that over and over. However, it is going to come down to which medical expert do you believe? The county said, and I have to read it so I am quoting exactly, cardiopulmonary arrest, complicating law enforcement, subdual restraint, and neck compression. In other words, that the officers caused that. And a second autopsy that was paid for by the family did say
Leslie, I don't want to interrupt you. I'm sorry. We got to, Leslie, we're turning to the trial now.
Leslie, I'd like to start with you on this, because contrary to a lot of what the sound bites have reduced this to, the actual text here says something different. So let's get your thoughts on the actuality of the bill and how that informs voting there in Georgia.
Well, the actuality of the bill, even if you look at within context, does prohibit an individual, poll worker or otherwise, from giving an individual water. And I would say that, discussing race within this is relevant. Here's a couple of things. One, Republicans in Georgia set up the laws within that state before this election. And let's be clear, there would be no change of the laws, in my opinion, in many people's opinion, and not just on the left, that there would be any changes to these laws had they not lost and Georgia had turned blue, electing 2 Democratic senators and Joe Biden as president. 1, 2. Let's look at where are the ballot boxes being taken out. Largely communities of color, who majority-wise stands in line for hours in the state of Georgia and many states in this country. But let's look at Georgia. Overwhelmingly people of color, more specifically African Americans, are standing in those lines for hours, where people were giving food and giving water in the last general election. And additional to that, who sometimes would not have an ID. In addition to many seniors, people who are homeless, people who are poor, largely people of color. So I do think it's right to bring up race. And if you give somebody water or not, what does that have to do with fraud?
Leo, when the issue becomes about race, it then becomes simple to vilify or ally whoever feels a certain way about it. Your thoughts on the arguments now taken by Democrats on this?
I'm offended by, and I have a tremendous amount of respect for Leslie, but I'm offended by anyone who tries to play the race card to protect me because I'm black. Let me be clear. I want to make sure everyone understands this, because I feel like I know this law better than anyone else. Jim Crow does not exist. I think a lot of people who use that term don't even know what it means. It's referring to segregation of issues and policies based on race. That does not exist. It was eliminated by the Voting Rights Act. Look at the history, but it's used as a throw-in term. No one knows what it means. I find it offensive for anyone to say that black people have a problem getting an identification card, a driver's license, voter ID. You look at every demographic. Everyone supports voters' ID because we want to make sure the people are the right person. Election integrity is to make sure we don't have fraudulent voting. Now, let's deal with this water issue. I read the law. It does not preclude anyone from bringing their own water. It stops electioneering. It stops people with an agenda from going in and offering water, trying to induce a voter. And regarding those long lines, look at the facts. They happen in Democratic precincts. And you know what the Georgia law does? It opens up additional precincts because these long lines are in Democratic precincts. I'm sick of this game. We got to stop playing the race card. Lindsey Graham is absolutely correct. And I'll challenge anyone on this show to tell me if Jim Crow laws exist in America. They do not. Stop it.
Before we get Jillian and Carly in here, Leslie, do you want to respond briefly to Leo's challenge there?
Yes, absolutely. Nobody is supposed to. First of all, you just said, Leo, and I never said Jim Crow, but certainly these districts are overwhelmingly people of color. And you just said it, Leo. They are what? They're Democratic districts, right? So there are more Democrats voting in those districts. And African Americans are more Democrat, not just in Georgia, but across the country. And not just African Americans, but people of color. I certainly, as a white woman, am not in a position to speak as an African American. But I certainly can speak to facts when you just look at the numbers. And we know that in Georgia, that the two Democratic senators, Ossoff and Warnock, and President Biden would not have been elected without the huge outpouring of support by voters, specifically in communities of color, and even more specifically by African Americans. And we also know that the Republican state decision makers of Georgia with regard to voting laws in that state didn't have any problem when the state was red. They only now have a problem when the state is blue. And when you just look at, again, where are those ballot boxes being removed? Why do you have to have any kind of information regarding a line? And I didn't say, and I haven't heard anybody say that black people, African Americans, have a more difficult, can't get an ID, but people who are poorer may have a difficult time. And are all African Americans poor? Absolutely not. There are people who are poor, well, that you know, transcend the rainbow of color in this country. However, disproportionately affected, we know, within poverty levels in this country, in Georgia as well, are people of color, not just African Americans, but they are included in that demographic.
Well, as the crisis at the border now appears to worsen virtually by the week, according to CBP's own data, Republicans are accusing Vice President Kamala Harris of going MIA, missing in action. Now, gut-wrenching new images are showing child migrants in cages at a border facility in Donna, Texas. The photos come from Texas Democrat Congressman Henry Cuellar. This as the media still remains locked out of these facilities. Now, President Biden officially tapped Vice President Harris to lead the U.S. response to the crisis last week. So far, she has not announced plans to travel to the border. Leslie, I want to bring you in here right away because I'm guessing you don't see the situation the same way that Carly just laid out. Tell us how you see it.
Well, quite frankly, I wouldn't say that. I think, you know, Americans, whether they're Democrat or Republican, you know, realize we have a problem. This has been a problem for 17 years. We have both Democrats and Republicans that say this has been something that's been, you know, kicked down the road. I don't think, and I would hope that the Vice President is not MIA, missing in action, but more so working on what is going to be the strategy and then the policy dealing with the Northern Triangle nations in Central America, dealing with Mexico, and dealing with the root cause. Because until we deal with the root cause, we haven't been able to, you know, for 17 years, stem the tide of these individuals coming. And I think one of the reasons Border Patrol can say, hey, this is probably going to happen for the next 7 months, is because they know what it's like historically when the weather warms up and when we don't have winter. And also, now that COVID numbers are reducing in, you know, countries throughout the world. So the bottom line is I do think that the Vice President should go to the border. It could be some logistical problems like the president had alluded to with him not going to the border. I certainly think that she should come out and tell us, but I think more so it's better if she tells us, okay, I have met with the leaders of these nations, this is what we've concluded, and this is what we plan to do going forward.
Welcome back. President Biden is eyeing a tax increase to pay for his $3 trillion infrastructure package and another round of coronavirus relief. Leslie, apparently in the infrastructure side of things, what will pay for that will be raising taxes on wealthier individuals. And then on the domestic side, it will be businesses and investors. How will any of that not hamstring the economy? This economy that's already sluggish because of the lockdowns, how will that prevent, or how will that achieve, I should say, the goals that this administration is trying to get when ultimately we know what that stymieing does?
So much to say. Leo, you know I love you, but you also know the federal government doesn't open schools. The states do, and the school districts within those states. I live in blue California, blue LA County, and my kids right now, hallelujah, are back at school part-time after spring break, full-time. To the budget, okay? Leo, you gave the Democratic playbook. May I give the Republican playbook, please? From my side, the Democrat. Republican playbook is, oh, we care about the debt. We care about the debt until we're the party in power. Nobody talked about the debt. Nobody talked about adding to the debt. $7.8 trillion added to the debt during the 4 years under President Trump, when Republicans had their guy and when Republicans had, more control than they do now in Congress. And now all of a sudden they're back to the party of worrying about the debt and worrying about how we're going to pay for it. Infrastructure. Infrastructure has been something that Democrat and Republican presidents and congressional members have wanted to get done. It has bipartisan support among elected officials, also bipartisan support among voters. And I'll tell you, how do you offset that money? Job creation. And one more time, GOP, $1.9 trillion with the tax bill. Not worried about that, worried about the COVID $1.9 trillion price tag. But infrastructure will create jobs, and people forget infrastructure is not just roads and bridges. It is transportation. It is broadband. It is water. It does play into national security. So infrastructure is something that might be costly. And lastly, it's not just a progressive agenda or a Green New Deal. When you talk about rich paying more, it's actually liked among a lot of Americans. If you look at the polls, a majority in some states, and many of which Republicans who feel to whom much is given, much is expected.
I just want to say really quick that I think we need a Leo and Leslie podcast. I'm just throwing that out there. Free for your consideration. I would subscribe. Sorry, Emily. I would just have to say that.
The Democratic mayor of Oakland, California, announced a new program to give $500 a month, no strings attached, to some low-income families of color. But low-income white families are expressly excluded. The program is the latest test of guaranteed income that has gained traction around the country. Leslie, this mayor of Oakland is a white female, and in re-election, she ran against a black female. Do you see issues here of performative activism versus actual allyship, especially as reflected in this then policy?
Absolutely. When anybody's left out, they're going to be angry. Personally, I think, and, if you listen to like Andrew Yang, you want to include all individuals and all families. But what is the goal specifically in Oakland? And I say that because this is the first city that is doing this specifically to people of color. And it's to shrink the racial income gap. By the way, this isn't new. Martin Luther King actually spoke about doing this, and not just to communities of color.